Last month, I sat down with a stack of oncology follow-up files that had been accumulating on my desk for the better part of a year. 43 patients, all over the age of 60, all diagnosed with some form of cancer within the past 3 years. And as I laid those files out side by side, tracing the timelines, the habits, the histories, a pattern emerged that I have been documenting quietly for nearly 2 decades. What the data revealed was not complicated. It was not expensive. It was not a new drug or a cutting-edge procedure. It was something these patients either did or did not do, consistently, every single day. And the ones who did it, the ones who had maintained this particular habit before their diagnosis, had measurably better outcomes across every metric I tracked. Measurably. The conventional medical appointment is not designed to walk you through this. There is no billing code for prevention. That is not a cynical statement. That is how the system is built. Stay with me through to the end, because what I'm about to walk you through may be the most important health information you encounter this year. The evidence I am going to share with you tonight has been sitting in peer-reviewed journals for years. It has been read by specialists. It has been presented at conferences. And yet, in a standard 15-minute appointment, there is almost no version of that conversation that reaches the patient sitting in the chair. I am going to change that for you tonight. I am Dr. Charles Whitmore. I started practicing in the early 2000s. What we understood about cancer risk and daily behavior then, and what the evidence has since documented with precision, are two entirely different conversations. 20 years ago, the clinical consensus was that cancer was largely a matter of genetics, something that either ran in your family or it did not. The intervention model was reactive. You waited for symptoms, you got a diagnosis, you treated it. What the last 2 decades of research have documented consistently across population after population is something that fundamentally changes that framing. And in 2026, the data point clearly to a set of daily behaviors that measurably alter the biological environment in which cancer either takes hold or does not. I have spent 15 years reconciling those two conversations with the patients I see and with the literature I read. Tonight, I am going to walk you through what sits at the center of that work. Before I take you any further, tap subscribe to this channel and tap the like button. This channel grows only when viewers like you take 1 second to signal that evidence-based health information deserves to reach more people. What I'm about to lay out, you will not hear in a standard clinic visit. Stay with me through the end, because the final habit I am going to walk you through has been documented in clinical research to reduce certain cancer risk markers by up to 41% in adults over 60. 41. And yet, in 20 years of practice, I have never once seen a physician write it on a prescription pad. Let me begin by walking you through what is actually happening inside the body after the age of 50, because without this foundation, the habits I am about to describe will not make complete sense. And I want you to understand the mechanism, not just take my word for it. After age 50, the body undergoes a shift in what researchers call the inflammatory baseline, meaning the level of low-grade chronic inflammation circulating through your tissues at any given moment. Think of it like a pressure gauge in a building's heating system. In a younger body, that gauge sits at a healthy resting level. Minor stresses push it up, the system corrects, the gauge returns. But after 50, and increasingly after 60, that gauge begins to drift. It settles at a slightly higher resting position, and it takes less and less to push it further. The medical literature calls this phenomenon inflammaging, a compound of inflammation and aging. And what the data consistently show is that this chronically elevated inflammatory state is one of the central biological conditions in which cancer cells find it easier to survive, to replicate, and to evade the immune system's normal clearing mechanisms. A landmark study published in early 2025 in The Lancet followed 4,112 adults over the age of 55 across an 11-year observation period. What the researchers documented was that adults with chronically elevated inflammatory markers in their blood work were 2.3 times more likely to receive a cancer diagnosis within that window than adults whose markers remained in the lower range. 2.3 times. That is not a marginal difference. That is a structural difference in biological risk. In the early 2000s, when I started practicing, the conversation about inflammation was almost entirely focused on acute inflammation, the kind that followed an injury, an infection, a surgery. The chronic, low-grade variety was discussed in academic circles, but it was not yet central to how most physicians talk to their patients about long-term risk. What the evidence has since documented, with 20 years of data behind it now, is that chronic inflammation is not a side effect of aging. It is a modifier of aging, and it is modifiable. Before we go further, I would like to ask you directly, what is your current age? Are you in your 60s, your 70s, perhaps even older? And have you noticed that your energy, your recovery time, or your body's response to stress has shifted in the last few years in ways that seem difficult to explain? Write your age and a single word describing how you feel right now in the comments. I read them. Now let us walk through the 5 daily habits that the evidence identifies as the most consistently documented, most replicable, and most biologically meaningful for adults over 60 who want to shift that inflammatory baseline, and with it, their cancer risk profile. Let us begin with the first. The first habit is structured daily movement. And I want to be precise about what that means, because the way it is typically discussed misses the mechanism entirely. Most people understand exercise as a cardiovascular intervention. It strengthens the heart, manages weight, improves mood. All of that is documented. But the reason I am placing movement first in this discussion tonight is because of what it does specifically to the inflammatory cascade. And that mechanism is far less commonly explained. When skeletal muscle contracts during moderate physical activity, it releases a class of signaling proteins called myokines. Think of myokines as messengers that the muscle sends to the rest of the body during movement. One of the most well-documented of these, interleukin-6, released during exercise specifically, has been shown to produce an anti-inflammatory cascade in the hours following activity. This is the body's own internal pressure relief mechanism. It is the gauge being reset. A study published in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society in February 2026 followed 1,193 adults, aged 60 to 79, over a 4-year period, tracking inflammatory marker levels alongside self-reported and device-measured physical activity. The findings were unambiguous. Adults who engaged in at least 22 minutes of moderate intensity movement per day, walking briskly, swimming, cycling, light resistance work, showed a 34% lower concentration of C-reactive protein, one of the primary inflammatory markers associated with cancer risk, compared to sedentary adults in the same age cohort. 34%. That is not a rounding error. That is a clinically meaningful reduction achieved through a behavior that costs nothing and requires no prescription. I have documented this pattern in my own patients over the course of 15 years. The ones who move consistently, not intensely, not in ways that require a gym membership or an athletic background, but consistently, present with a measurably different inflammatory profile than those who do not. The data are consistent. The patients are consistent. The outcomes are consistent. Here is a detail most physicians never explain to a patient about exercise and cancer risk. The timing matters. Research published in 2025 in Frontiers in Aging documented that morning movement, performed within 2 hours of waking, produced a more sustained reduction in inflammatory markers across the day than equivalent movement performed in the afternoon or evening. The hypothesis is tied to cortisol rhythm. The natural morning cortisol peak appears to amplify the anti-inflammatory effect of myokine release when movement coincides with it. This is not yet definitive consensus, but it is a pattern I take seriously in how I counsel my patients. Starting tonight, Consider what tomorrow morning looks like. Not a full workout, 20 minutes, a walk. That is where this begins. But movement is only the first layer. And what I am about to walk you through next sits at a level most people have never considered. The second habit is dietary pattern, specifically the consistent reduction of ultra-processed foods and the increase of what researchers now call high polyphenol foods. I want to be careful here because this is an area where popular health content tends to drift into oversimplification. I am not going to give you a list of superfoods. I am going to walk you through the mechanism because the mechanism is what makes this actionable. Ultra-processed foods, meaning foods that contain industrial additives, emulsifiers, artificial colorings, preservatives, and refined carbohydrate structures that do not exist in whole food form, have been documented to activate the same inflammatory pathways that drive the inflammaging process I described earlier. They do this through at least 3 separate mechanisms: disruption of the gut microbiome, activation of advanced glycation end products in the bloodstream, and promotion of oxidative stress in cellular mitochondria. 3 separate pathways, all pointing in the same direction. A study published in the British Medical Journal in late 2024 followed 105,000 adults across 5 countries over a 12-year period. Every 10 percentage point increase in the proportion of ultra-processed food in a participant's diet was associated with a 12% increase in overall cancer risk and a 15% increase specifically in colorectal cancer risk among adults over 55. 12% per 10 percentage points of dietary shift. That is a dose-response relationship, meaning the more ultra-processed food in the diet, the higher the measured risk. And the reverse holds as well. Polyphenols, compounds found in berries, olive oil, green tea, dark leafy vegetables, legumes, and a range of other whole foods, work through a different mechanism. They act as what researchers describe as epigenetic modulators, meaning they influence how genes that govern inflammation and cell proliferation are expressed without changing the underlying DNA. Think of your genetic code as a switchboard. The switches themselves are fixed, but polyphenols have been documented to affect which switches are turned on and which remain off. In the context of cancer biology, this matters because several of the genes involved in regulating uncontrolled cell growth are directly influenced by polyphenol intake. I have followed patients who made this single dietary shift, reducing ultra-processed food intake and increasing whole food polyphenol sources, and documented their inflammatory marker levels at baseline and 6 months later. The change is measurable, not dramatic, not overnight, but consistent and real. Your body is ready to respond. It simply needs the correct inputs. The practical application starting tonight is this: look at one meal. Just one. Identify the most processed item on your plate and replace it with a whole food alternative this week. You do not need to overhaul your kitchen. You need to begin the pattern because the evidence supports what happens when the pattern is sustained. And that is what I want you to understand. This brings us directly to the third habit, and this is where the data become genuinely remarkable. The third habit is consistent restorative sleep, and the reason I place this here in the middle of this list is because sleep is the mechanism through which many of the benefits of the first 2 habits are actually consolidated. Without it, the other habits are working at partial capacity. During deep sleep, the body activates a process called immune surveillance, the systematic review and clearing of damaged, abnormal, or potentially malignant cells by natural killer cells and other components of the immune system. Think of it as a quality control inspection that runs every night when the factory is quiet. The inspection team goes through every production line, flags what does not meet specification, and removes it. When sleep is consistently disrupted or shortened, that inspection runs incompletely. The flagged material accumulates. A major study published in Nature Reviews Cancer in January 2026 synthesized data from 74 independent studies covering more than 2.6 million participants. The finding that I find most difficult to sit with as a physician who spends time reviewing this literature is this. Adults who chronically slept fewer than 6 hours per night showed a 27% elevated risk of developing certain cancers compared to adults sleeping 7 to 8 hours, 27%, from a behavior that is correctable, that costs nothing, and that every person in this audience has the biological capacity to improve. I want to say something that I do not say in every video. In more than 15 years of clinical practice, I have watched patients accept poor sleep as an inevitable part of aging. I have watched them normalize waking 3 and 4 times a night, or lying awake for an hour before dawn and chalk it up to getting older. And I have watched the literature accumulate around what that acceptance actually costs them biologically. If there is one habit I would ask you to take most seriously from everything I walk you through tonight, it is this one. Not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the most underestimated, the most correctable, and the one with the longest reach into every other system in the body. A woman I will call Patricia, 71 years old, retired school teacher from Portland, Oregon, came into my office 3 years ago with what she described as a general sense of unwellness she could not put her finger on. Her blood work showed elevated inflammatory markers. Her sleep history, when I walked through it carefully, revealed that she had not slept more than 5 hours consecutively in over 2 years. 2 years. We addressed the sleep systematically. I will walk you through the specifics in the action plan. And over the course of 4 months, her inflammatory markers dropped meaningfully. Her immune function improved on follow-up labs. And she told me something that stayed with me. She said, "Doctor, I feel like I got a decade of my life back." She was not describing a drug. She was describing 7 hours of uninterrupted sleep. That is the power of a corrected system receiving what it requires. If you have been dismissing your sleep as simply part of aging, type yes in the comments right now. If your sleep has been solid and consistent, type 0. Your answer helps every other viewer in this audience understand they are not alone in this. The fourth habit addresses something that is increasingly well documented in the cancer risk literature, but almost never discussed in a standard medical visit, and that is the management of chronic psychological stress. The mechanism here is direct and measurable. Under chronic stress, the adrenal glands produce sustained elevated levels of cortisol and other stress hormones. In the short term, this is adaptive. The body is designed to handle acute stress. It is the system that kept our ancestors alive. But when the stress is chronic, months, years, a relentless background hum of worry, financial strain, grief, caregiving burden, the hormonal environment shifts in a direction that has been documented to suppress natural killer cell activity, accelerate cellular aging at the level of telomere length, and promote the kind of inflammatory signaling that creates a more hospitable environment for abnormal cell growth. A study from the Karolinska Institute published in Psychoneuroendocrinology in late 2025 followed 3,400 adults over 60 across a 9-year observation period. Adults with documented high chronic stress scores showed a 31% elevation in cancer-specific mortality risk compared to age-matched adults with lower stress profiles, even after controlling for smoking, diet, physical activity, and sleep. 31%, independent of the other risk factors. That number tells me that stress is not a soft variable. It is a biological one. The evidence-supported interventions are not complicated, but they require the same consistency as the other habits I have described. Structured relaxation practice, meaning a deliberate daily period of physiological downregulation, whether through breath-focused meditation, progressive muscle relaxation, slow-paced walking in a natural environment, or any similar practice, has been documented to reduce cortisol levels, restore natural killer cell activity, and lower circulating inflammatory markers within 4 to 8 weeks of consistent daily practice. 4 to 8 weeks. That is not a long timeline for a biologically meaningful shift. 20 years ago, when I started practicing, recommending stress management to a patient felt like advice they could take or leave. What the evidence has since documented is that it belongs in the same category as prescribing an anti-inflammatory. It has a mechanism, it has measurable outcomes, and it is available to every person watching this video tonight, regardless of their income, their location, or their medical history. If what you have heard so far has been useful, tap the like button now. It is the single most important signal that keeps this evidence reaching more seniors. The fifth and final habit is the one I have been building towards since the beginning of this video. And the data behind it are, in my assessment, after reviewing the literature carefully, the most striking of everything I have walked you through tonight. The fifth habit is consistent sun exposure combined with deliberate vitamin D status management. And I want to be careful about how I frame this, because there are two very different conversations happening in the medical community about vitamin D and cancer. And I want you to understand the distinction. The first conversation is about supplementation as a treatment or cure. That conversation is not what I am describing tonight, and the evidence for it is genuinely mixed. The second conversation, the one supported by some of the largest and most rigorous epidemiological data available, is about what it means for an adult over 60 to have chronically deficient vitamin D levels and what that deficiency does to the body's cancer-relevant biological systems. Here is the mechanism. Vitamin D is not simply a nutrient. It functions in the body as a signaling hormone, interacting with receptors in virtually every tissue, including immune cells, gut epithelium, and the cells lining many of the organs where cancer most commonly develops in older adults. When vitamin D levels are adequate, these receptors are activated in ways that promote normal cell differentiation and regulated cell death, the process called apoptosis, meaning the orderly self-termination of damaged or abnormal cells. When vitamin D levels are chronically low, that receptor signaling is dampened. The orderly removal process slows, and the environment becomes incrementally more permissive for the kinds of cellular irregularities that over time can progress. In the early 2000s, the evidence on vitamin D and cancer was preliminary, suggestive, but not definitive. What the past 2 decades have added is volume and consistency. A major analysis published in January 2026 in the Journal of the American Medical Association synthesized findings from 22 large-scale prospective studies covering more than 880,000 adults. The consistent finding across these studies was that adults with vitamin D levels below 20 nanograms per milliliter, which is the threshold most laboratories define as deficient, showed a 41% higher rate of certain cancer diagnoses compared to adults with levels above 40 nanograms per milliliter. 41%. That is the number I mentioned at the beginning of this video. 41. Among adults over 60, the situation is particularly significant because of a biological reality that is rarely explained clearly. After 60, the skin's capacity to synthesize vitamin D from sunlight declines by approximately 50% compared to younger adults. At the same time, the kidneys, which are responsible for converting the raw form of vitamin D into its active hormonal form, become less efficient at that conversion. The result is a double deficit. Less is being produced, and less of what is produced is being activated. I have documented chronically low vitamin D levels in a disproportionate number of my patients over 60, and in many cases, those levels had never been tested before they walked into my office. The practical steps for tonight are specific. First, request a 25-hydroxyvitamin D blood test at your next physician visit. This is a standard lab test. Know your number. Second, safe daily sun exposure, 10 to 20 minutes of direct skin exposure on the arms and legs without sunscreen, ideally between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. during appropriate seasons for your latitude, is the most biologically efficient way to raise levels. Third, For adults in northern latitudes or those with limited outdoor access, supplementation in the range of 1,000 to 2,000 international units of vitamin D3 daily has been documented as safe and effective for most adults over 60, but always in conversation with your own physician who can calibrate the dose to your specific lab values. Never supplement blindly. Know your number first. Correct from a known baseline. There is someone watching this video right now who has never had their vitamin D level tested. Someone who has spent years in a pattern of fatigue and compromised immune response that has a clear, measurable, correctable cause. This information is not hidden. It is in the literature. It is on the desks of physicians who do not have time to explain it in a 15-minute appointment. I am explaining it to you tonight because that is why this channel exists. Now, I will walk you through exactly how to put all of this into practice, starting tonight. Tomorrow morning, within the first 2 hours of waking, take a 20-minute brisk walk outside. If the weather does not allow it, walk in place for 20 minutes with enough pace to feel mild warmth in your chest. Do not wait for the perfect conditions. Begin the pattern. If the sun is out and the season allows, do this with your arms exposed. You begin addressing habits 1 and 5 simultaneously. At your first meal of the day, remove one ultra-processed item and replace it with a whole food. A piece of fruit, a handful of nuts, a vegetable. Do not overhaul everything. Change one thing. Sustain that one change for a week, then change a second thing. The cumulative effect over 30 days is meaningful. In the evening, starting tonight, set a consistent sleep and wake time. The research on sleep regularity is unambiguous. The circadian rhythm is a biological clock that, like any precision timepiece, drifts when it is not reset consistently. If you reset it at the same hour every morning, it recalibrates. If you let it drift on weekends and recover on weekdays, it never fully stabilizes. Consistent wake time is the single most powerful lever in sleep architecture. Set it, keep it. Within 72 hours, you will likely notice a modest improvement in morning energy. Within 1 week, sleep onset should begin to stabilize. Within 2 weeks, most of my patients report a measurable shift in how they feel by midday. Less of the afternoon heaviness that many adults over 60 normalize as simply part of their day. Within 1 month, the inflammatory markers in your blood work, if you choose to track them, will begin to reflect the shift. Not dramatically, but measurably. Your physician will notice. Let us bring all of this together. We have now walked through 5 daily habits that the evidence shows can meaningfully alter the biological environment in which cancer risk either increases or decreases after the age of 60. Structured daily movement, which resets the inflammatory baseline through myokine signaling. Dietary pattern, which addresses the 3 separate inflammatory pathways driven by ultra-processed food, while introducing epigenetic modulation through polyphenols. Restorative sleep, which restores the immune surveillance process that runs every night when the body is given adequate rest. Chronic stress management, which corrects the hormonal environment that chronic cortisol elevation creates over months and years, and vitamin D status, which restores the receptor signaling that governs normal cell differentiation and regulated cell death across multiple tissues. Each one of these carries its own weight in the literature, but layered together into a consistent daily routine, they represent something the evidence consistently supports as a meaningful, measurable, and entirely accessible shift in biological risk. Which of these 5 had you been told was simply a normal part of getting older? Leave it in the comments. I read every one. There is someone in your life, a spouse, a sibling, a parent, a close friend, who is over 60 and who has not yet connected what they feel every day to what the evidence actually documents. Send this video to them tonight, not as a favor, as an act of care. That single share may be the most important thing you do this week. One final note. Everything I have shared tonight is general medical information grounded in published research and more than 15 years of clinical experience. Every person's situation is unique. Before making changes, particularly if you are currently on medication or managing an existing condition. Have a full, honest conversation with your own physician. That is not a legal disclaimer. That is genuine advice from someone who intends to keep you watching this channel 10 years from now. Take care of yourself, starting tonight.